rural community in northwestern Florida is shaken when hunters stumble upon a horrific scene.
The body had decayed. Animals were feeding on the remains.
They noticed immediately that she had blunt force trauma to her head area.
My heart just broke. I've never had to go through anything so painful. Knowing that she's not coming back.
The ensuing investigation uncovers turmoil in their victim's life.
You're going down the wrong path and you're hanging out with the wrong people, and something's gonna happen to you.
As authorities zero in on a potential culprit, a sordid romance becomes the focal point of the investigation.
Jealousy could have gone into play.
I don't know what the hell went through her head.
It was getting dangerous for her.
They both just snapped at that point and just freaked out.
Nobody deserves to go through what she did.
Levy County is known as Florida's natural paradise. Located along the state's lush Gulf coastline, the region is characterized by scenic marshlands and abundant wildlife.
Levy County is a very rural county, very sparsely populated, and we have oak hammocks, pine forest, and about 52 miles of coastline on the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of woodland area, a lot of hunting area.
At 12:30 p.m. on January 18, 2013, 911 dispatchers in Cedar Key receive a disturbing phone call from two local hunters.
We had our police radio running, and we heard the call that human remains had been discovered. My sergeant and I decided we needed to respond. The area is uninhabited. People used it to deer hunt on. When we walk into the scene, we see what are obvious human remains wrapped in a black cloth. Animals were feeding on the remains. The right arm is exposed and it's skeletonized, and part of the upper torso is exposed from under this wrapping, and it's also skeletonized. The rest of the remains was covered with this black cloth. We were fairly certain that we had the remains of a female in front of us, and we were basing that on the condition of her hand and her fingernails. They were painted and manicured. She was most likely killed or had died at another location, and her remains had probably been placed there. You see that there's some scavenging that's been done, so it then becomes a little bit more difficult to tell how long she'd been there, but we predicted that she'd been there for at least several days. My sergeant and I decided we needed to find out how the body was discovered, which led us into our conversations with the hunters who had located the body. The hunters said they had shot at a deer in that area, so they were looking for it. And one of them said he saw a buzzard fly up. So he walks into the woods and actually stepped into the bushes and found her concealed there. For us, everybody is a suspect until they're eliminated. It's not uncommon to have a murderer go back to the scene of the crime. But we determined that both these gentlemen were in their 60s, and they stumbled upon a scene that they'd never seen before in their life and never expected to see.
A forensic team combs the area for evidence, but is unable to find anything of value.
So her remains were then transported to the medical examiner's office located in Gainesville, Florida. The team of investigators actually participate with the medical examiner. So as the wrappings come off, we're able to see more of the person that is underneath there. She did have clothing on. She has some shorts and a tank top on underneath the wrappings. So law enforcement is there to collect any potential forensic evidence that might be on that clothing, as well as the wrapping.
They noticed immediately that she had blunt force trauma to her head area. However, they noted that it wasn't the cause of her death. So from there, they ordered a toxicology report.
While blood samples are sent off to the lab for a toxicology screen, the medical examiner works to identify the victim.
She had numerous tattoos, a couple of stars on her abdomen, There was a established N tattoo on her right wrist.
We also had a hair color. We had an approximate age range, height, approximate weight. With all this information combined, we were able to put that information out to our law enforcement partners in the general area. And they had a missing person matching that physical description. And ultimately, we determined that the person that was at the medical examiner's office in Gainesville, Florida, was Deanna Stiers from nearby Hernando County. Detectives from Hernando and Levy County started working together, and with Citrus County right in between us, ultimately you have these three coastal communities that are now working together.
According to the police report, the 18-year-old has been missing for nearly a month.
Her father had listed her as a missing person around the 1st of January, and the last time they had spoken to her was December 23rd.
We have to figure out who was Deanna and how did it come that she was dumped in the middle of the woods.
We got a knock on the door, and it was two detectives. We didn't think that we were going to be told, like, we found a body. It didn't feel real. There's no way it's her, but that was just me fighting, like, my worst fear.
My heart just broke. I've never had to go through anything so painful. Knowing that she's not coming back.
Fun-loving and carefree from a young age, Deanna Stiers had called Hernando County, Florida, home her whole life.
When Deanna was born, it was amazing. She was just perfect. Deanna and Alyssa always played really good together.
Me and her are really close. She cracked a lot of jokes. You know, she always wanted to make you smile.
Deanna was always such a joy. She knew no stranger. She was a lover, and she was a girly girl. Like, she was just beautiful. She had these gorgeous eyes, like, that just would melt your heart.
I met Deanna at Brooksville Elementary. We were in 3rd grade. We talked every day, and then we started going over each other's house, and we were inseparable.
In 2007, Deanna's parents decided to divorce, leaving her and her sister under their father's care in Florida.
Deanna's father and I was married for 18 years. We kind of just grew apart. I moved away to New York and stayed in contact, visiting, tried to stay as close as possible with them.
My dad was working 2 jobs, and my grandpa lived right across the street. While my dad was working, our grandpa took care of us.
We spent a lot of time at her papa's house. Papa was everything to all of us. He was the most awesome man in this world. There was nowhere safer than being with Papa or at Papa's house.
My grandpa passed from a heart attack. We were trying to go over there to hang out, and when we looked through the window, we could see him like gasping for air and stuff, so we called 911. They took him to the hospital, and that's where he passed.
Despite witnessing something so tragic, Deanna allowed the experience to inspire her career goals.
She wanted to go to nursing school, and she was so loving and compassionate, and she really had a knack for helping people.
By December 2012, Deanna was making plans to move out of her dad's house in the coming months.
Right before Christmas, we got our nails done and bought some new clothes and stuff to hang out for after Christmas.
Day before Christmas, Deanna was partying and going out and having a good time.
Deanna was supposed to come home on Christmas morning. That morning, I spoke to her around like 8, just saying that she wasn't feeling good. She was tired. She would talk to me later. And I tried calling back around like 11 a.m., 12 p.m. Deanna's phone was shut off. Her phone was just going to voicemail.
I tried calling, texting. I figured maybe she was just sleeping. Anything except for the worst thought. We stayed in touch always. So that's when, after so many days of it, I just told Alyssa, this isn't looking good.
Now, nearly 3 weeks later, the search for Deanna Stiers has come to a tragic end. Deanna's sister reveals Deanna's life had taken an unexpected turn after their grandfather's passing 2 years earlier.
I just know that when Papa passed away, she was super upset and kind of started spiraling. She kind of went down a dark path.
To numb her pain, she kind of let herself loose with like wanting to drink, and she started hanging around with the wrong friends. So we kind of just had like a gut feeling that these friends were involved.
We found out she might have been hanging out with the wrong types of people. We needed to identify these people.
Coming up, disturbing details from Deanna's autopsy and toxicology reports come to light.
She died as a result of acute drug toxicity.
I thought somebody had done it to her. There's no way that that was an accident.
And investigators key in on a possible suspect with a questionable motive.
They said, I was waiting for somebody to come talk to me.
She told him, I need to know where to bury a body that won't be found.
Authorities have identified 18-year-old Deanna Stiers as the murder victim found on a remote hunting ground on Florida's Gulf Coast. And investigators have learned that Deanna's family fears her new friends could be involved.
And we found that Deanna, she was a little bit of a wild child. She probably partied too much.
It was like a low point in her life where one party turns into, a whole nother bender. Her friends found people to get them alcohol, and some of these people were way too old to even be hanging out with Deanna. There's a lot of people who were, old enough to be her father, showing her around. During one point in time, I did have a conversation with Deanna, warning her, you're going down the wrong path and you're hanging out with the wrong people, and something's going to happen to you. It was getting dangerous for her.
My sister Melba, she would try and help her. Look, I'll buy you a plane ticket right now if you just come up here, but she never showed up.
Me and Deanna weren't hanging out too much then because I didn't agree with what she was doing. And so a lot of the times that we talked, they were check-ins to make sure that she was okay.
Before investigators can track down any of Deanna's new friends for questioning, they receive the results of the autopsy and toxicology reports.
One thing that was noted from the medical examiners were the blunt force trauma that was on Deanna's head matched up with basically the butt end of a pistol grip. The indentations were the markings that would be fit to using a gun or someone being pistol whipped.
The medical examiner determined the manner of death to be homicide because she died as a result of acute drug toxicity, being morphine.
I thought somebody had done it to her with the levels of the morphine that was in her system. There's no way that that was an accident.
Investigators surmise that Deanna was drugged against her will, leading them to explore another possibility.
The state of Florida was actually ranked number 3 highest for human trafficking in the United States with a trafficker. One of the tactics that they'll use against their victim is they will inject them with drugs. So now you have someone you captured, you're turning them into basically depending on whatever drugs that you're using with them, and they become addicted as well. And it's just all manipulation and a control tactic.
It's not uncommon for human trafficking for people to be utilized for drugs. So human trafficking was discussed in the investigation, simply because the amount of time that she was missing, the types of people that she was known to hang around. We don't have a great deal of that in Hernando County, so we didn't know who might be involved in this.
Following that lead, investigators scour Deanna's personal records to determine a timeline of her last known whereabouts. They discover that her debit card was last used at a nearby gas station.
That card had been utilized in Citrus County the day after Christmas on December 26th.
I was able to go and make contact with the management. We were able to get the surveillance video. It appeared to be an adult male. We did create an alert bulletin, and we sent that out. And we got a response from the crime analysis unit in Citrus County, where someone had identified that male subject as Kevin Shields. Kevin Shields is a longtime resident of Floral City, which is also in Citrus County.
And so the detectives went to Floral City and conducted an interview with him.
We knocked on the door. Mr. Shields greeted us, and he said, I was waiting for somebody to come talk to me. He felt like he had some important information to share.
Kevin Shields and Deanna were just recently acquainted. The 24th of December, Kevin was with Deanna. They partied at his house.
When investigators ask Kevin about his last interaction with Deanna, he explains that she left his home early on Christmas morning with two of his friends, 35-year-old Crystal Brinson and Crystal's boyfriend, 41-year-old Byron Boutin.
Byron and Crystal and Deanna all left together and returned to Homosassa, where Byron lives, in Citrus County.
It was then that he described a conversation that he had with Byron Boutin and Crystal Brinson.
He tells us around the 26th of December, he's sleeping and he's woken up by Byron and Crystal.
He described them arriving to his house, driving Byron's car. They were both acting as though something had happened.
And Boutin told him, I need to know where to bury a body that won't be found.
Ultimately, what they shared was Deanna was dead in the trunk of the car. Kevin said he never looked in the trunk, so he couldn't say positively whether or not she was in there. But they did discuss on what to do with the body. The best course of action that they could come up with was dumping her body somewhere. Kevin went into great detail explaining how he would do it, which made us think maybe he had something to do with it.
Unsure of his involvement in the crime, investigators take Kevin into custody and immediately focus on locating their two new suspects.
The investigation determined Crystal Brinson had 2 prior felonies. They were drug-related charges, and she had 3 misdemeanors. Byron Boutin was a 2-time convicted felon, and he had 6 prior misdemeanor convictions.
Hernando County did an emergency teletype message to make contact with Byron and Crystal.
Florida authorities are searching for Crystal Brinson and Byron Boutin after Kevin Shields claims the duo is responsible for dumping the body of 18-year-old Deanna Stiers.
After being made aware of the information from Kevin, the Citrus County Sheriff's Office went and made contact with Byron, and he volunteered to be interviewed.
While Byron admits that he knew Deanna Stiers, he claims he hasn't seen her since the day before Christmas.
He was not very accommodating. We talked about Deanna and whether he'd seen her. He said she was partying for a few days, that she left with some guy. She was in good health and in good spirits.
He was very agitated and disinterested in anything, including emotion, about the situation. And he said that he wasn't involved. Those are normally signs of people being deceitful when you interview them.
Despite their suspicions that Byron is lying, investigators have no evidence to hold him. They release Byron and head to Crystal Brinson's registered address.
Crystal was living with me at the time, off and on. Detectives come out and talk to me. Well, you know, when was the last night she stayed here? I said, I haven't seen Crystal in about 2 weeks. And they said, well, we're looking for her, and it's important. They wanted everything about Crystal.
Crystal was a dancer and a beauty queen. She was pretty blue eyes, blonde, just very outgoing, cheerful, and she was in a lot of pageants. And she won first place, many, many trophies. After she finished high school, she did classes to be a phlebotomist.
Investigators learned that Crystal's interest in medicine quickly faded when she picked up a side hustle that drew in more income.
Crystal went into exotic dancing at clubs. She got hired easy because she was a looker. And Crystal was a free bird. She wasn't shy at all. But when she was exotic dancing, she started experimenting with drugs because I think that might have been the scene. She liked the thrill and the action. Crystal would meet these guys. They were wealthy guys, too, and prominent people. And they flashed her with a lot of money. But they would take advantage of her, too, and dump her. After they broke up, she would start over another cycle.
Crystal's mother reveals that her daughter had recently gotten involved with 41-year-old Byron Boutin.
One of my roommates introduced her to Byron. And I didn't want that to happen because he had a reputation of being a bad boy. I said, please don't go around Crystal. So she did it anyway.
Crystal and Byron's relationship seemed like it could be slightly toxic. Definitely drugs involved. They're residing together. They seem like a party-type couple.
Crystal and Byron, they were spending a lot of time together. They just took off. I didn't see Crystal for weeks at a time. So I didn't even know where she was at. Detectives told me if I can reach her, that I needed to call the police station right away.
While calls to Crystal's cell phone go unanswered, investigators managed to track down one of her closest friends, a local resident known as Mama CJ.
Her real name is Connie Waller. She was an older lady. This was the house where everybody congregated to party. We did interview Mama CJ. Initially, she denied any involvement. She provided us with a lot of false information. She was acting very suspicious. We definitely pressed her to finally come out with the truth. She was not directly involved in the murder, but she was made aware of the murder. She helped cover it up.
Mama CJ informs investigators that on December 26th, Crystal Brinson and Byron Boutin had contacted her for help.
They said Deanna was in and out of consciousness in Citrus County at Byron's house.
She was in an overdose state from morphine that was injected into her.
They decided that they needed to put her in the car. They brought her to Hernando County to a house that Byron Boutin's father owned, where they stuffed a rag of some sort in her mouth, probably to keep her from calling out for help.
And they secure her to this inversion table. So the inversion table normally would sit upside down, but they had it propped up on another table where it was laying flat, and they had her secured to that. Byron and Crystal decided to go to Mama CJ's house, and their intention was to get her and bring her back so that she could deal with the problem with Deanna. When they brought Mama CJ back to the house in Hernando County, they discovered that Deanna is deceased from overdose.
Mama CJ admits she collected Deanna's belongings and discarded them, while Crystal and Byron worked out a plan to get rid of the body.
They had wrapped Deanna's body up and placed her in the trunk of Byron's vehicle. They dropped Mama CJ off at her house, and that's when they drove up to Kevin Shields' house with Deanna in the trunk.
They both just snapped at that point and just freaked out, and they wanted to get rid of her any way that they could.
The following day, I started drafting a search warrant for Byron's father's house and Byron Boutin's residence.
Coming up, a harrowing confession reveals a possible motive.
She was like, you didn't her, did you?
You have a younger female, outgoing, very attractive, taking attention away from her. Jealousy could happen.
And we finally were able to get some of the truth out of him.
She hit her like a bunch of times, like really fast.
Florida authorities investigating the murder of Deanna Stiers have secured a search warrant for the location of her death, a property owned by the father of Byron Boutin.
We were having coffee, and the sheriff's department came to the house. I looked, there were 13 sheriff's deputies' cars, and then I knew something was wrong. And George was like, what's going on? And they said, well, there's been a crime committed. And Byron never told us a thing. We were surprised. We still didn't really know what happened.
With the father's cooperation, we searched the detached garage. We did find this inversion table in the father's garage.
After determining Byron is not on the property, investigators questioned Byron's father and stepmother and learned that long before Byron had a criminal record, he held a respectable rank in the U.S. Navy.
Right after high school, he signed up. He was in submarines in the Gulf War.
I was very, very proud of him to go into service.
Byron's parents explained that after Byron was honorably discharged, he struggled to settle down.
He changed after he went to the Navy. He changed. There's no doubt about it.
I think that's maybe when he started discovering the drugs. George bought Byron a mobile home, and George and Byron were flipping mobile homes at that time. That was a good way to make money.
Byron was a hard worker. He was good with his hands. He was excellent in mechanics and electronics. I thought he was not a violent guy at all, so I was shocked.
Investigators wrap up their interview with Byron's parents and head to Byron's house 15 miles away. When they arrive, Byron is waiting for them.
Deputies took him back to the Citrus County Sheriff's Office while we looked through the residence.
He had a safe full of guns in it. We did find this .380, and upon observing this .380 pistol, we saw hairs at the front tip of the pistol that were lodged into the slide of the pistol.
In addition to that, there was apparent blood spatter.
There was like the framing of the back door, and there was some blood there. There were also blood droplets on pieces of carpet throughout the residence. We sent out for forensic processing. Some of the fabric that Deanna was wrapped in matched the curtains that Byron had in his house. And also some of the bindings were matched up to some of the bindings that was in his shed out back. We also executed a search warrant on the Lincoln that belonged to Byron. As we got into the vehicle, there was also some blood that was located in the trunk.
The blood spatter was subsequently forwarded to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Laboratory down in Tampa.
Investigators return to the station and confront Byron Boutin with their findings.
We had a lot of evidence, and we had Mama CJ and Kevin Shields' story.
That is when he, to use the phrase, gave it up.
And we finally were able to get some of the truth out of him.
Byron admits he was there when Deanna was attacked, but he claims he isn't responsible for her death.
So Byron told us that he and Crystal brought Deanna back to his house that early morning of Christmas.
I go back to my house where I proceeded to go directly to bed. Deanna came in and laid down with me, you know, like snuggled up.
Okay. Did Crystal come in?
Maybe like a couple of times.
And what was her reaction?
She was like, you didn't her, did you? I said, no. I don't know what the hell went through her. I guess she said, you better not her.
Byron claims he finally got up when he heard the two women arguing.
Allegedly, Deanna got a hold of some of their stash, which drove Crystal into a rage.
He informed us that Deanna freaked out and Crystal ended up giving her a injection of morphine. And then all of a sudden she became fearful of Crystal. Crystal ends up pulling out a .380 pistol.
Crystal hit her like a bunch of times, like really fast.
Where?
Like right around this area somewhere.
In the back of the head?
Yeah, like the neck or somewhere in there.
Deanna was bleeding and fell to the ground and was pretty much unconscious.
So they loaded her up into Byron's vehicle. And from there, they drove to Byron's father's house.
His father was out of town, so there was nobody there at the house. When he pulls her out of the vehicle, she's snoring and sweating profusely. And so they bring her into the garage.
What did you end up doing with Deanna?
So my judge at this conversion table. So they propped that up so it was flat like an army cot. And we put her on there.
Did you ever strapped into the inversion table?
Yes, so she could like roll off of it if she freaked out.
They ended up tying her hands behind her back. They duct taped them behind her back.
Okay, what exactly did Crystal do to her mouth?
She put the little rag thing or whatever there.
And did she put a tape over it to keep it in place?
Yeah, she did.
Okay.
I can tell you, I really wasn't cool with any of that.
Why did you let her do that? Why did you let Crystal do that?
I honestly didn't see myself as having a choice at that moment.
They had left her at this house in Hernando County.
She'll get Mama and come back. And then she could tell us where Deanna lived or wherever. Whatever to do from then on. And all three of us got back there to my dad's garage. And I went over to see if she needed to be covered up more or uncovered or... And I could just tell right away that she was gone.
Gone, you mean?
I mean, not in this world anymore.
She was dead?
Yeah.
So then they wrapped her up and put her in the trunk of his car.
Byron reveals that he and Crystal stored Deanna's body in the trunk for 2 days.
Did she ever get taken out of your trunk? Did you guys ever move her anywhere else?
No.
They drove her to Kevin Shields' house, and they were asking him of a good place to dump a body. This corroborated Kevin Shields' side of the story.
And him and Brinson thereafter dumped the body up in Levy County.
All right, man. We can be done. You know already there's the price to pay. You know, you're going to be arrested because this girl paid the ultimate price. She deserved more than lies and cover-ups and stuff.
Yep, I agree.
Upon conclusion of that interview, Byron was immediately charged with the murder of Deanna Stiers.
At that time, Byron was only arrested for murder in the second degree and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. For first-degree murder, there has to be evidence of a premeditated intent to kill.
I just thought to myself, how could my daughter even know these people? Deanna was 18, and here they're late 30s, early 40s.
Byron put the blame squarely on Crystal Brinson, and he basically said the actions that contributed directly to the death of the victim in the case were performed by Crystal Brinson.
I was just glad that Byron wasn't out there to hurt anybody else or cause anybody else any harm.
While Crystal has evaded authorities thus far, investigators receive word she's been arrested on a separate charge.
She was actually involved in a domestic altercation in Hernando County.
Citrus County detectives went to interview her, they told her they wanted to speak with her concerning a homicide.
Crystal denied having any involvement whatsoever.
And then she asked for a lawyer.
Obviously, when an individual who is in custody requests a lawyer, all questioning ceases.
Without Crystal's cooperation, investigators must determine if Byron is telling the truth and what prompted Crystal to kill Deanna. Authorities speculate if jealousy may have been a motivating factor in the crime.
Jealousy could have gone into play. Any type of substance abuse that's involved in it, it just elevates it to a whole other level.
I don't know what the hell went through her. I guess she said, you better not her.
If the sexual relationship's going on, Crystal may have seen Deanna basically as a threat.
In June of 2013, Crystal Brinson and Byron Boutin have been charged in the murder of Deanna Stiers. Following Byron's confession, investigators theorize that Deanna may have inadvertently become a threat to Crystal and Byron's relationship.
You have a younger female, outgoing, very attractive, taking attention away from her. Jealousy could happen.
Because Crystal had already requested a lawyer, the detectives could not go back in to try and interview her again. So she never gave a formal statement.
Investigators still need hard evidence connecting Crystal to Deanna's death. When they received the results from the crime lab, they hit pay dirt.
Byron Boutin's .380 semi-automatic handgun, that had Boutin's DNA on it. It had Deanna's DNA on it, and it had Crystal Brinson's DNA on it. The blood spatter that was recovered from inside Boutin's home, that was Deanna Stiers' DNA. The DNA evidence that was recovered out of Boutin's vehicle turned out to be Deanna Stiers. The trunk liner also contained Deanna Stiers' DNA. Originally, Byron only got arrested for second-degree murder, but given the laboratory developments, that changed to murder in the first degree.
For their cooperation, witnesses Kevin Shields and Mama CJ are not charged in connection to the murder of Deanna Stiers. In August 2013, Byron's case goes to trial.
It was very emotional and nerve-wracking knowing that you're sitting there looking at these monsters, thinking like, how can you do this? How can you treat a human like that? It's an unforgivable act.
While prosecutors feel confident in the evidence against Byron, the defense continues to put the blame squarely on Crystal Brinson and claims Byron wasn't physically present when Deanna was given a lethal dose of morphine.
There was a party at the house, and Crystal Brinson was pretty much instrumental in getting these drugs together for the party. The state's case had to basically show that there was apparently a lethal morphine hot shot that was injected into the victim. They had to prove that my client was part of that process, but Byron was sick and he was in his bedroom, so his position was that he was not guilty.
It said maybe Crystal was in a fit of jealousy and raging, and she was extremely upset. And as a result, Crystal took it upon herself to inject her with a lethal dosage of morphine.
There weren't no jealousy going on, nothing like that. They were partying together, and Crystal would never be jealous.
On August 23rd, 2013, the jury retires to deliberate Byron's fate.
When the jury went out to deliberate, I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I was just praying that he was found guilty. We went out and ate lunch, and then we got the call that the verdict had came in.
Byron was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury didn't see fit to find him guilty of first-degree murder, but the court decided the appropriate sentence was life in prison. And if you get life in prison, it's a natural life in Florida.
When the jury read the verdict that he was found guilty, I was super excited.
Byron Boutin will come out of prison in a pine box.
Crystal Brinson avoids going to trial by accepting a plea deal.
I went and spoke to Deanna's mom and had the discussion about did she want to go through another trial or not, or we could let her plead to murder in the second degree, open to the cap of 25 years in state prison. And she went along with that. And then the defense, to use my phrase, put on a dog and pony show about the way Crystal was raised, that she was a beauty queen and this, that, and everything else.
The judge sentences Crystal to just 12 years in prison.
Byron and Crystal both were guilty of murdering Deanna. How can one get life in prison and the other one get 12 years? She should have gotten life in prison as well.
I don't feel like we got justice with Crystal.
It is a very sad story that you have a young lady who's just beginning to figure out life fall into a drug world and bad people that take everything away from her. And it's just not her that suffers, it's the survivors, the family, the friends.
Deanna was just the sweetest, loving, compassionate. She was everything that you would want your kid to be. They cut her life short. Nobody deserves to go.
It begins with a door that never should have been left unlocked. A quiet suburban street in Northern California where porch lights flickered out one by one and the night swallowed its secrets whole. Where in the early hours of a spring morning in 1995 a scream may have been heard or may have existed only in the memory of someone who woke suddenly and then convinced themselves it was nothing, because nothing ever happened on this street. Not like this. Not until the house at the corner became the center of a cold case that would stain the town for decades. The house looked ordinary from the outside. Beige siding, trimmed hedges, a driveway still warm from the engine of a car parked too hastily. And inside, the air carried the sharp metallic smell that first responders would later describe with careful restraint, the kind of language used when a scene refuses to be forgotten. She was 23 years old, found on the bedroom floor, the window cracked open as if someone had paused there to listen to the silence before vanishing. And nothing about the room made sense because it looked lived in, interrupted, as though time had snapped like a wire under tension. Police arrived before sunrise, red and blue lights bleeding across the quiet lawns, neighbors stepping outside in robes and disbelief, whispering the word murder as if saying it too loudly would invite it closer. This was not a neighborhood that knew violence. This was California optimism, mid-90s calm, a place where people locked doors out of habit, not fear, and where the idea of a killer slipping through the dark felt like a rumor imported from somewhere else. Detectives moved carefully, photographing footprints that led nowhere, collecting fibers that clung stubbornly to hope, bagging items whose significance was unclear but potentially devastating, and among them, a small biological trace no one fully understood at the time, cataloged and stored, labeled with a number that would sit in evidence for years, quiet, patient, waiting for a future that had not yet caught up. Her name dominated the local news for weeks. Her face printed beside the word mysterious, brutal, unsolved, and friends described her in fragments that could not be assembled into a defense against what had happened. She had plans. She had just started talking about moving. She had told someone she felt watched, or maybe she hadn't, because memory changes under pressure and grief edits the past until it sounds prophetic. The first theory came quickly, as it always does, the nearest explanation reaching out to comfort investigators with its familiarity. A boyfriend questioned, an ex-lover scrutinized, arguments replayed like evidence, alibis stretched thin under fluorescent lights. Nothing held. Each suspect collapsed under the weight of facts that refused to align, and with every release, the community's faith in certainty eroded a little more. Rumors followed. A stranger, a drifter, someone passing through town just long enough to leave devastation behind. Witnesses called in tips that led to empty fields and dead ends, to men who looked wrong in the dark but proved harmless in daylight. Sketches were drawn, broadcast, forgotten. The case thickened with paper but thinned of answers. Months passed, then years. The file grew heavy enough to bend shelves. Detectives retired. New ones inherited the boxes, the photographs, the tape-sealed bags of evidence that smelled faintly of time. Each new investigator began the same way, with confidence and fresh eyes, convinced they would be the one to notice what everyone else had missed, to read the crime scene like a confession rather than a riddle. Each one left eventually, quieter than when they arrived. The case became a whisper, a warning told to new residents, a reason doors were locked with intention now, a name spoken only when someone wanted to explain why they still checked their windows twice at night. Cold case. The phrase hardened like ice around the truth, preserving it, trapping it, making it unreachable. Technology marched forward without waiting for justice. DNA databases expanded. Techniques sharpened. What once was noise became a potential voice. And somewhere in a storage facility, under layers of procedure and dust, that small biological trace waited, unnoticed by the passing years, indifferent to the town that aged around it. In 2019, a detective nearing the end of his career reopened the file not because he believed he would solve it, but because some cases refused to stay buried, because the weight of unfinished work can follow a person into retirement, and because something about the evidence list had always bothered him. A line item too easily dismissed in 1995, too fragile to analyze then, too valuable to ignore now. The sample was sent to a lab with tools the original investigators could not have imagined, processed with methods that turned fragments into profiles, whispers into something that could be compared against millions of others. And when the results came back, they did not offer a name, but they offered direction, a genetic shadow that pointed outward, toward relatives, toward a family tree that would have to be built branch by branch. Genealogists entered the story quietly, working alongside law enforcement, tracing bloodlines backward and outward, assembling connections from public records and probability, narrowing a vast population into a handful of possibilities, each one closer than the last, each one sharpening the shape of the unknown intruder who had stepped into that bedroom in 1995 and stepped back out into anonymity. One name began to surface more often than the others, a man who had lived within driving distance at the time, whose life intersected the town only briefly, whose past included moments that, in hindsight, felt heavy with implication. Investigators watched him from afar, careful, methodical, collecting discarded items, waiting for confirmation that could justify the word solved after so many years of silence. When the DNA matched, the room reportedly went quiet. No chairs, no relief, just the sound of decades compressing into a single moment. The realization that the case everyone believed had gone cold had been breathing the entire time, waiting for science to catch up. Arrest made. Headline written. Shock delivered to a community that had learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent resident. But certainty is a dangerous thing, because even as officials announced the breakthrough, even as the phrase cold case solved flashed across screens, questions surfaced immediately, uncomfortable, insistent, refusing to stay beneath the surface. How had he avoided detection for so long? Why here? Why her? Why no similar crimes? And perhaps most disturbing of all, whether the answer finally found was the whole truth or merely the most convenient shape it could take. Families grieved again, this time with a name attached to the pain. Neighbors revisited memories they had sealed away. Investigators stood by their conclusion, backed by science, by statistics, by a match that could not be coincidence. And yet the house on the corner remained heavy, as if the walls themselves understood that resolution does not always equal peace, that some crimes leave echoes too deep to be quieted by an arrest alone. Because even solved cases can remain haunted, and even with DNA, even with certainty printed in bold letters, the night of 1995 still lingers, asking its questions softly, reminding everyone that the truth, once delayed, never arrives unchanged, and that some cold cases, no matter what the headlines say, never truly stop breathing. The arrest did not bring silence the way people expected. It brought noise, a low, relentless hum of questions that crept into kitchens and offices and late-night conversations. Because once the word solve is spoken out loud, it invites scrutiny, and scrutiny has a way of reopening wounds that never quite healed. The suspect's name spread fast, printed beneath old photographs pulled from forgotten records. A face unfamiliar to most, yet disturbingly ordinary. The kind of man you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance. The kind who does not look like a headline until the headline claims him. Detectives retrace the timeline with new eyes, laying modern certainty over old uncertainty, watching the events of that night replay with sharper edges. He had been in the area, they said. He had reason, though no one could quite articulate what that reason was beyond opportunity and proximity. Two words that carry enormous weight in a courtroom and very little comfort in a living room where the lights are kept on just a little longer than before. Back in 1995, the investigation had been fast, urgent, chaotic. Patrol officers secured the perimeter while neighbors clustered behind yellow tape, tried to remember anything unusual, any sound, any shadow that moved wrong. Detectives knocked on doors with notebooks full of blank pages, asking questions that felt intrusive and necessary all at once. Who was home? Who had visitors? Who owned a car like that? The answers had poured in, overlapping, contradictory, shaped by fear and the sudden realization that safety was not guaranteed by geography. Now, decades later, those same streets looked smaller, tighter, as if time had compressed them. Houses had been renovated. Trees grew taller. Families moved in and out, unaware they were inheriting a place that once made national news. The past was invisible unless you knew where to look, unless you remembered the sound of sirens cutting through dawn or the way the air felt heavier for months afterward. Investigators revisited witness statements long dismissed as unreliable. A jogger who claimed to see a figure near the house just before sunrise. A neighbor who heard a car door slam and assumed it was a teenager sneaking home late. A cashier who remembered a man buying something insignificant at a convenience store a few miles away, his hands shaking, his eyes refusing to meet hers. None of it had been enough then. Now, threaded together with DNA, it began to resemble a pattern, fragile but persuasive. The suspect denied everything. He did it calmly, firmly, with the practiced confidence of someone who had lived an entire adult life without being called to account for that night. He said he had never met her. He said he had no memory of being anywhere near that street. He said science could be wrong, statistics misleading, coincidences misunderstood. His lawyers echoed the sentiment, reminding anyone who would listen that time erodes evidence, that memories decay, that a match does not equal a motive. And motive remained the hollow center of the case. The missing piece investigators could never fully supply. There was no documented relationship, no letters, no calls, no witnesses who could place them together in daylight. The prosecution leaned on probability, on the near impossibility of such a DNA profile belonging to anyone else, on the idea that some crimes are committed not out of passion or rage, but impulse, opportunity, a moment where something dark surfaces and then retreats. The community listened, divided between relief and unease. Some wanted the story to end here, to accept the narrative and finally exhale after decades of holding their breath. Others felt a subtle resistance, a sense that the conclusion arrived too cleanly, too late, wrapped in scientific authority that discouraged dissent. Cold cases teach people to doubt resolution, to understand that answers delayed by years are answers shaped by the tools available when they finally emerge. Journalists descended again, resurrecting archives, reprinting photographs that families had tried to forget. Headlines declared justice served, but interviews told a more complicated story. Friends of the victim spoke of dreams where she still knocked on doors that would never open. Former detectives admitted, off the record, that the case had haunted them, that they replayed decisions, wondered what might have changed if technology had arrived sooner, if one more test had been possible, if one more lead had been chased harder. Inside the courtroom, the past and present collided. Grainy crime scene photos from 1995 appeared on high-definition screens. Evidence bags yellowed with age were opened with careful ceremony. Expert witnesses spoke in precise language about alleles and probabilities, about how the genetic material found could not reasonably belong to anyone else. Jurors listened, trying to translate scientific certainty into moral certainty, trying to imagine a crime committed before smartphones, before social media, before the world learned to document itself obsessively. Outside, the house remained empty, its windows dark, its address now infamous. People drove past slowly, sometimes without realizing why their foot eased off the accelerator, sometimes feeling an inexplicable chill as they passed. Real estate listings avoided mentioning history, but history does not need advertisement. It settles into foundations, into the way neighbors glance at the property and then away. As the trial unfolded, alternative theories resurfaced online, fueled by true crime forums and armchair investigators who dissected timelines and questioned procedures. They pointed to inconsistencies, to evidence collected late, to the absence of clear motive. They asked whether DNA, powerful as it is, could tell the whole story of a human act, whether it could explain intent, context, or the possibility of contamination decades earlier. Law enforcement responded with confidence, emphasizing protocols, chain of custody, independent verification. They framed the case as a triumph of persistence, proof that no crime is truly forgotten. That time favors truth if given enough patience. And yet, even among supporters, there was an undercurrent of discomfort, an awareness that justice delivered after so long arrives to a different world, one where the people it was meant to protect have already adapted to its absence. The victim's family stood at the center of it all, absorbing attention they never sought. They spoke carefully, measured in their relief, cautious in their language. Closure, they said, was not a door that slammed shut, but a window cracked open, letting in air that was both fresh and cold. They acknowledged the power of the evidence while admitting that nothing could restore what was lost, that the future stolen in 1995 remained stolen no matter what verdict was reached. As closing arguments approached, tension sharpened. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who crossed paths with a victim by chance and acted without foresight, leaving behind the one thing he could not retrieve. Defense attorneys countered with the absence of corroborating behavior, the lack of similar crimes, the danger of convicting someone based on science alone when human narratives remained incomplete. The jury deliberated behind closed doors, the weight of decades pressing against the present moment. Outside, reporters waited, microphones ready, prepared to declare an ending. But endings are complicated in cases like this, layered, conditional, contested. Whether guilty or not, the story had already changed the town again, reopening conversations about safety, memory, and the fragile line between knowing and believing. And beneath it all, a quieter question lingered, one no verdict could fully address. If this case could sleep for so long before awakening, how many others lay dormant, their answers locked inside evidence waiting for a future technology, a future detective, a future moment when the past would finally speak. The cold case had been warmed by science, illuminated by data, but the shadow it cast remained long, stretching backward to that night in 1995 and forward into a community still learning how to live with a truth that arrived decades too late. The verdict, when it came, did not land like a thunderclap. It settled like dust after a collapse, heavy, unavoidable, coating everything it touched. And even before the foreperson spoke, people in the room seemed to sense that whatever happened next would not simplify the past, only redefine how it was carried forward. Guilty. The word echoed once, then again in headlines, stripped of nuance, compressed into something clean enough to print, while the reality behind it remained jagged, uneven, resistant to neat conclusions. For law enforcement, the conviction was framed as vindication, a declaration that persistence matters, that science rewards patience, that even a case buried under decades of doubt can be resurrected and brought into the light. Press conferences emphasized the DNA, the certainty of the match, the improbability of error. Officials spoke with practiced restraint, careful not to sound triumphant, careful not to acknowledge the quieter truth that success had arrived only because technology had finally outrun the limitations of the past. But for the community, the aftermath felt less like resolution and more like a return to vigilance. People who had grown up hearing fragments of the story now found themselves revisiting it in full, absorbing details their parents had shielded them from. The crime became a reference point again, a marker of vulnerability, a reminder that the threat had not been imagined, that it had lived among them, unseen, unchallenged for years. The convicted man was transferred to a state facility, his movements now documented, monitored, contained. Photographs captured him older than anyone remembered, hair gray, posture stiff, the face of a life that had continued uninterrupted until it suddenly did not. Commentators debated what justice meant in this context, whether a sentence delivered so late could truly account for the time already stolen, whether punishment delayed becomes something else entirely. Inside the victim's former home, nothing changed because nothing could. The house remained vacant, a silent witness to both the crime and a long wait for answers. Attempts to renovate stalled. Buyers walked through quickly, voices hushed, eyes lingering on the bedroom doorway, as if expecting something to emerge. The structure itself seemed to resist being normalized, as though memory had soaked too deeply into the walls. As weeks turned into months, cracks appeared in the official narrative, not large enough to dismantle the verdict, but persistent enough to invite scrutiny. Independent analysts revisited the case file, focusing on what had not been presented at trial, what had been deemed irrelevant or too speculative. They questioned the absence of physical signs of forced entry, the lack of defensive wounds consistent with a prolonged struggle, the possibility that the encounter had been brief, unexpected, over before it could be fully understood. Speculation crept back in, quieter now, more cautious. Some wondered whether the victim had known her attacker, whether familiarity rather than randomness explained the ease of access, the absence of neighbors noticing anything overtly suspicious. Others suggested a scenario where multiple individuals could have been involved, where the DNA identified one presence but not necessarily the full story. These ideas circulated mostly online, rarely acknowledged by authorities, dismissed as distractions rather than alternatives. Former detectives weighed in anonymously, expressing both pride and unease. They defended the science unequivocally while admitting that investigations conducted across decades inevitably carry gaps, moments where certainty is inferred rather than observed. They spoke of cold cases as living things, altered by every new tool applied to them, reshaped by the questions asked in each era. The victim's friends struggled with a new reality, caught between relief and disorientation. For years, they had imagined the perpetrator as a faceless threat, a shadow capable of existing anywhere. Now that shadow had a name, an address, a documented history. Some found comfort in that transformation, believing it restored order to chaos. Others felt unsettled, sensing that the specificity made the crime feel smaller, less commensurate with the damage it had caused. Memorials appeared briefly, flowers placed near the property, notes written by strangers who had followed the case from afar. They faded quickly, removed by weather or time, or the quiet agreement that prolonged attention might reopen wounds better left undisturbed. The town resumed its routines, but routines now carried an undercurrent of awareness, a collective understanding that safety is provisional, dependent on factors beyond familiarity or trust. In academic circles, the case became a reference point, cited in discussions about forensic genealogy and its implications. Experts praised its effectiveness while warning of its power, emphasizing the responsibility that accompanies such tools. They spoke of balance, of transparency, of the need to ensure that technological certainty does not eclipse investigative rigor. The case, once local, now belonged to a broader conversation about how justice evolves and at what cost. The convicted man appealed, as expected, challenging procedures, interpretations, the weight given to genetic evidence over circumstantial ambiguity. Legal briefs dissected the investigation with surgical precision, highlighting every deviation from protocol, every assumption made in the absence of contemporaneous corroboration. The appeals process moved slowly, deliberately, extending the life of the case beyond a verdict, ensuring it remained unresolved in spirit, if not in law. Meanwhile, the victim's name continued to surface in media retrospectives, anniversary pieces that attempted to reconcile the story's beginning and end. Writers struggled to capture the emotional distance between 1995 and the present, to explain how a single night could ripple outward across decades. Some succeeded. Others reduced the narrative to a triumph of science, overlooking the human toll of waiting so long for answers. Late at night, in homes scattered across the town, people revisited their own memories of that era. They recalled where they were when they first heard about the crime, how it altered their behavior, how it lingered in the background of their lives. For some, the conviction felt like a closing chapter. For others, it reopened a book they had tried to shelve permanently. And then there were those who could not reconcile the idea of a solved cold case with the persistence of doubt they felt. Not because they rejected the evidence, but because the passage of time had changed their relationship to certainty itself. Decades of unanswered questions had taught them to live without resolution, to accept ambiguity as a condition rather than a failure. The sudden arrival of an answer disrupted that equilibrium, replacing a familiar uncertainty with a less familiar form of belief. As the appeals process wound on, the case settled into a strange duality, legally concluded yet emotionally active, cited as proof and questioned as precedent. It existed simultaneously as an example of justice served and a reminder of justice delayed, its meaning shifting depending on who was telling the story and why. And somewhere beneath the legal arguments, the scientific debates, the media narratives, the original night remained unchanged, fixed in memory, resistant to reinterpretation. A door unlocked, a window open, a life interrupted. No technology could rewind that moment or fully illuminate every decision made within it. The cold case may have been declared solved, but the questions it left behind continued to circulate, quieter now, but no less persistent, woven into the fabric of a community that understood, perhaps better than most, that answers do not always arrive with the clarity people expect, and that even when they do, they rarely erase the shadows cast by the long wait for truth. Time did not soften the edges of the story. It sharpened them, turning every unanswered question into something more pronounced, more difficult to ignore, and as the appeal process stretched forward, the case began to feel less like a conclusion and more like a living argument about truth itself. Court filings replaced headlines, dense and technical, stripping the emotion from events that had never truly lost their charge, and yet beneath the legal language, the same night in 1995 pulsed, unchanged, insisting on being reckoned with again and again. The defense focused its energy on the spaces between facts, the moments where inference filled in for observation, where assumptions hardened into conclusions. They argued that DNA, while powerful, was not narrative, that could place a person at a location without explaining how or why, that it could not reconstruct intent or sequence with certainty. They questioned the original evidence handling, the storage conditions, the possibility of secondary transfer in a world that had not yet learned to fear contamination the way it does now. Prosecutors responded with unwavering confidence, emphasizing redundancy, cross-verification, the improbability of coincidence stacked upon coincidence. They reminded the court that the genetic profile was not a partial whisper, but a near-complete signature, that the likelihood of error bordered on the absurd. They framed doubt as discomfort rather than reason, a natural reaction to delayed justice rather than a legitimate challenge to the evidence itself. Outside the courthouse, the town watched from a distance, less invested in the procedural details than in the emotional implications. For many, the conviction had already rewritten the past, replacing the faceless unknown with a defined figure, a person who could be blamed, contained, and discussed without drifting into abstraction. For others, the ongoing legal maneuvering reopened wounds they had tried to close, reminding them that certainty, once claimed, can still be contested. Conversations shifted subtly. Where people once spoke about the crime in hushed tones, they now debated it openly, citing articles, referencing expert opinions, drawing lines between what they believed and what they could prove. The case became a mirror, reflecting individual attitudes toward authority, science, and the idea of finality. It revealed fault lines that had always existed but rarely been exposed so clearly. The victim's family remained largely silent during this phase, choosing distance over commentary. Their absence was noted, interpreted in conflicting ways. Some saw it as strength, a refusal to be pulled back into public scrutiny. Others read it as exhaustion, the natural response to a process that had already consumed decades. Those closest to them understood it as survival, a way to protect what little peace had been reclaimed after years of uncertainty. Media coverage adapted to the new rhythm, less sensational but no less persistent. Long-form pieces replaced breaking news, exploring the broader implications of forensic genealogy, the ethics of using familial data, the balance between innovation and privacy. The case was cited as both success story and cautionary tale, a demonstration of potential and a warning about over-reliance on any single form of proof. Meanwhile, the house remained untouched, an anomaly in an otherwise evolving neighborhood. Children who had not been born when the crime occurred now walked past it on their way to school, unaware of its significance, while older residents still avoided looking directly at it, as if acknowledging the structure might invite the past to speak again. The property existed in a liminal state, neither abandoned nor alive, suspended between histories. Investigators, some retired, some newly promoted, followed the appeals with professional interest and personal investment. For those who had worked the case early on, the conviction felt like vindication tempered by regret, a reminder of how much had been beyond their reach at the time. For younger officers, it was a lesson in patience and humility, evidence that cases can outlast careers, that the work done today may not bear fruit until long after names and faces have changed. Online, debates intensified. True crime communities dissected every document, every transcript, every expert statement. They mapped timelines, compared similar cases, proposed alternate scenarios that range from plausible to speculative. The sheer volume of analysis ensured that the case would never fully recede, that it would remain active in the collective imagination regardless of legal outcomes. Some voices urged restraint, cautioning against the erosion of trust that constant skepticism can bring. Others argued that questioning is not erosion but responsibility, especially when technology accelerates faster than the frameworks designed to govern it. The case became a battleground for these philosophies, a concrete example through which abstract concerns could be argued. As months passed, the appeals court issued procedural rulings, small decisions that shaped the path forward without resolving the core dispute. Each update reignited interest briefly before settling back into a low simmer. The waiting became familiar again, echoing the long years when nothing happened at all, when silence itself had been the defining feature of the case. In quiet moments, some residents admitted to an unexpected nostalgia for that silence. Not because it was preferable, but because it was simpler. Uncertainty had been painful, but it was stable. Resolution, contested and conditional, demanded ongoing engagement, a willingness to confront complexity rather than retreat from it. The convicted man remained largely out of sight. His presence felt more through legal documents than physical appearances. When he did appear, it was in still images captured by court cameras, his expression unreadable, his demeanor controlled. Observers searched those images for clues, for signs of remorse or defiance, projecting meaning onto features frozen by time and circumstance. Experts cautioned against such readings, reminding audiences that behavior under scrutiny is performance as much as revelation. They emphasized that the absence of visible emotion proves nothing, that guilt and innocence do not manifest reliably on the surface. Still, the images circulated, fueling speculation, satisfying a human need to see something tangible in a story built largely on abstraction. As another year marked the anniversary of the crime, commemorations were subdued. No official statements, no renewed calls for attention. The date passed quietly, acknowledged only by those who remembered its significance. In that quiet, the true weight of the case became apparent, not in headlines or verdicts, but in the way it had threaded itself through lives, shaping choices, influencing fears, altering trajectories in ways impossible to quantify. The cold case, once defined by absence, now existed as accumulation, layers of interpretation built atop a single night. Each layer added clarity and confusion in equal measure, illuminating certain aspects while obscuring others. The story refused to resolve into a single, uncontested version, insisting instead on plurality, on the coexistence of evidence and doubt. And so the town continued, carrying the case forward not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible, permanent, and sensitive to pressure. It served as a reminder that justice is not a moment, but a process, uneven and human, shaped by the tools available and the values applied. The DNA breakthrough had changed everything and nothing at once, providing answers while exposing new questions, closing one chapter while ensuring the story would never fully end, lingering in the spaces where certainty meets memory and where even solved cases continue to cast long, restless shadows. As the years following the conviction unfolded, the case slipped into a quieter phase, not forgotten, but absorbed into the background noise of a town that had learned how to live alongside unresolved things. The urgency faded, replaced by a steady, low-grade awareness that justice, once declared, does not simply settle, it reverberates, testing the structures meant to contain it. People stopped checking for updates daily, then weekly, yet the story resurfaced in unexpected moments, a name mentioned in passing, a reference made without explanation, the assumption that everyone already knew. The appeals moved slowly, methodically, grinding through procedural layers that felt abstract compared to the rawness of the original crime. Legal arguments turned on phrasing, on whether certain expert testimonies should have been framed differently, on whether jurors had been adequately instructed on the limits of forensic genealogy. Each motion filed was another reminder that certainty, once introduced into a system built on doubt, must be constantly defended. Inside academic and law enforcement circles, the case continued to circulate as a study in contrasts. Training seminars referenced it as an example of perseverance rewarded, while also highlighting its vulnerabilities, the points where future investigations might falter if lessons were not absorbed. It became a caution against complacency, a reminder that technological breakthroughs do not erase the need for narrative coherence, for context, for the slow, human work of understanding behavior. Meanwhile, the physical evidence that had driven the case's revival remained locked away, preserved with an almost reverential care. The DNA sample, once overlooked, now occupied an outsized symbolic role, standing in for an entire investigative process. It was both hero and burden, celebrated for what it revealed and scrutinized for what it could not. In conversations among experts, it was often invoked with qualifiers, an acknowledgement that even the most precise tools carry limitations that must be respected. The victim's memory evolved, too. shifting as new generations encountered the story without the immediacy of fear that had defined its early years. To them, the crime was history, a narrative anchored to a date rather than a lived experience. They learned about it through articles, podcasts, documentaries that framed the case with dramatic pacing and ominous soundtracks, transforming personal tragedy into consumable mystery. Some found this unsettling, others inevitable, a sign of how stories survive when first-hand witnesses fade. Those who had known her pushed back quietly against simplification. They spoke of ordinary details, of laughter, of plans that had nothing to do with crime or justice. They resisted the tendency to define her solely by the manner of her death, reminding anyone who would listen that she had been more than a case file, more than a catalyst for debate about forensic science. Their voices were softer now, less amplified by media interest, but no less determined. The house changed ownership briefly, then returned to vacancy. Attempts to inhabit it seemed cursed, as if the space rejected permanence. Neighbors speculated without malice, half joking about bad energy, half serious in their belief that some places retain memory. The structure became a landmark of absence, its significance understood but rarely articulated, a silent agreement that some histories resist erasure. Late one evening, a former investigator drove past the property for the first time in years. He did not stop. He did not need to. The sight alone was enough to stir memories of early morning briefings, of coffee gone cold as evidence lists were reviewed, of the gnawing sense that something essential was being missed. He reflected on how certainty had eventually arrived, not through insight, but through innovation, and wondered whether that counted as success or simply timing. Across the country, other cold cases benefited from similar breakthroughs, their resolutions celebrated with optimism. Each success story reinforced faith in the method, yet also heightened scrutiny as defense teams across jurisdictions prepare to challenge genetic evidence more aggressively. The California case was cited repeatedly in these arguments, its strengths and weaknesses parsed in filings and opinions, its influence extending far beyond the town it originated in. For the convicted man, life narrowed to routines and paperwork. His appeals became his voice, his primary means of asserting relevance in a narrative that had largely moved on without him. Supporters were few but vocal, framing him as a symbol of overreach, a casualty of society's eagerness for closure. Critics dismissed these claims as denial, an unwillingness to accept accountability cloaked in legal rhetoric. The truth, whatever it was, remained bound to interpretations shaped by perspective and belief. Periodic court decisions punctuated the quiet, each one reigniting interest briefly before settling back into the slow burn of uncertainty. None overturned the conviction outright. None fully silenced debate. The case existed in a suspended state, legally stable yet philosophically contested, its meaning shifting depending on who was asked and when. In the town, subtle changes endured. Security systems became standard. Neighbors learned each other's routines. The crime had taught lessons that outlived its resolution, shaping behavior long after headlines faded. People spoke less about fear and more about awareness, a reframing that felt healthier, more sustainable, even if it traced its origins to violence. On the anniversary of the conviction, a small gathering formed at a local park. Not an official memorial, just a handful of people who felt compelled to acknowledge the passage of time. They spoke quietly, sharing memories, reflecting on how much had changed since 1995 and how much had not. There was no consensus on what justice looked like now, only a shared recognition that the case had become part of the town's identity. As night fell, the conversation drifted, touching on unrelated topics, laughter breaking through the heaviness. Life asserted itself, as it always does, insisting on continuation. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of evening, the case remained present, a reminder that some stories do not end so much as they recede. Their influence felt rather than seen. The cold case, once frozen by lack of evidence, now lingered in a different state, warmed by answers yet cooled by doubt. It had achieved resolution without finality, clarity without simplicity. For those who lived with it, that paradox became familiar, almost comforting in its honesty. It acknowledged that truth is rarely singular, that justice is rarely clean, and that the past, once disrupted so profoundly, never fully releases its hold. And so the story continued, not in dramatic revelations or sudden twists, but in the quiet persistence of memory, in the way a single night could shape decades, and in the understanding that even when science speaks with confidence, the human need to question, to interpret, to seek meaning beyond data, endures. The California cold case had been declared solved, yet its legacy remained open-ended, a testament to the complexity of uncovering truth in a world where time both reveals and obscures, and where every answer carries the shadow of what might never be fully known. Years slipped by almost unnoticed, not marked by dramatic developments, but by the slow recalibration of how the case lived in public consciousness, fading from breaking news into something more abstract, more philosophical, a reference point rather than an active wound. And yet, beneath that calm surface, the story continued to move, reshaped by conversations happening far from the town itself. In courtrooms, laboratories, policy meetings, and late-night debates where the meaning of justice was argued with the intensity once reserved for the crime itself. The appeals process reached a critical stage when a higher court agreed to review the admissibility standards used in the original trial, not to relitigate guilt, but to examine how genetic genealogy had been explained to jurors. The decision reignited national attention, not because it promised reversal, but because it touched something fragile, the boundary between innovation and interpretation, between what science can prove and what people believe it proves. Legal analysts dissected transcripts line by line, focusing on language, on metaphors used by expert witnesses, on whether probability had been framed as certainty or possibility. They argued that numbers, when spoken aloud, carry emotional weight far beyond their mathematical meaning, that jurors unfamiliar with statistical reasoning might hear inevitability where none was explicitly stated. The prosecution countered that clarity is not coercion, that simplifying complex science is not the same as exaggerating it. For the town, this renewed scrutiny felt distant and strangely intimate at the same time. Few residents followed the legal arguments closely, yet many felt a familiar tightening when the case returned to the news cycle. It was a reminder that the story was not finished, that its conclusions were still negotiable, still subject to revision by forces beyond local control. Former jurors spoke rarely, bound by etiquette if not law, but those who did emphasized the seriousness with which they had approached their role. They described long deliberations, careful review of evidence, moments of doubt weighed against overwhelming probability. None claimed certainty in the philosophical sense. They spoke instead of responsibility, of choosing the explanation that best aligned with the facts presented, knowing that perfection was not an option. The victim's family watched quietly as the debate shifted from what happened to how it was explained. Their grief had already been shaped by decades of waiting. Now it was being refracted through discussions about phrasing and pedagogy. They expressed frustration privately, not at the process itself, but at the way their loss had become a vehicle for broader arguments. They wanted the world to remember the human cost beneath the abstraction. In universities, the case entered syllabi, studied alongside landmark decisions that altered evidentiary standards. Students debated it with intensity, some siding with technological optimism, others warning of overconfidence. They spoke about future implications, about how many convictions might rest on similar foundations, about the safeguards required to prevent misuse. The case became less about one crime and more about the trajectory of an entire system. Meanwhile, the physical artifacts of the investigation aged quietly. Evidence bags remained sealed. Photographs yellowed slightly at the edges. The objects themselves did not change, but the stories told about them did, evolving with each retelling, each reinterpretation. The crime scene, frozen in images, became a canvas onto which different narratives were projected, some emphasizing randomness, others suggesting familiarity, all attempting to impose order on chaos. The house was finally sold again, this time to an out-of-town buyer unaware of its full history. Renovations began slowly, cautiously. Walls were repainted, floors replaced. Neighbors watched with mixed emotions, some relieved, others uneasy. The transformation felt symbolic, as if altering the physical space might finally loosen the grip of the past. Yet, even as the exterior brightened, the address retained its weight, its reputation traveling faster than any new coat of paint. The convicted man remained at the center of legal attention, but increasingly peripheral to public interest. His name appeared less often, replaced by discussions of method rather than individual. This shift unsettled some observers, who worried that reducing the case to a procedural example risked erasing accountability. Others welcomed it, arguing that systems, not just people, must be scrutinized to prevent future harm. In quiet interviews, law enforcement officials acknowledged the tension openly. They defended the conviction while conceding that no tool should be immune from challenge. They spoke of humility, of a need to balance confidence with caution. For them, the case had reinforced an uncomfortable truth that solving a crime does not end responsibility. It transforms it, shifting focus from pursuit to preservation of trust. The appeals court eventually issued its opinion, dense, careful, unsatisfying to those seeking drama. It upheld the conviction while recommending clearer guidelines for future cases, emphasizing transparency and how probabilistic evidence is communicated. The ruling was hailed as pragmatic, criticized as evasive, and largely misunderstood by a public conditioned to expect definitive answers. Reactions in the town were muted. There were no celebrations, no protests. The decision felt like confirmation of what most had already accepted, paired with an acknowledgement that the path taken was imperfect. Life continued with minimal interruption, a testament to how thoroughly the case had been integrated into the community's identity. Still, the ruling did not end debate. It shifted it. Discussions now focused on policy rather than guilt, on frameworks rather than facts. The case's influence extended outward, shaping legislation, informing best practices, serving as a cautionary example cited in committee hearings and professional conferences. Its legacy became institutional, less visible but more enduring. The victim's name appeared again in these contexts, sometimes stripped of personal detail, used as shorthand for an entire category of cases. Advocates pushed back against this reduction, insisting on remembrance alongside reform. They organized small events, funded scholarships, found ways to anchor the story in humanity rather than abstraction. As another decade approached since the original crime, reflections grew more introspective. Writers explored not what happened, but how time had altered perception, how certainty had evolved, how communities metabolized trauma. They noted how the case had transitioned from fear to fascination to philosophy, tracing a path common to unresolved or belatedly resolved tragedies. Late one night, a local radio station replayed an old news segment from 1995, the crackle of tape underscoring the urgency in the reporter's voice. Listeners heard the uncertainty of that moment, the absence of answers, the rawness of the unknown. For some, it was a reminder of how far things had come. For others, it underscored how little the core questions had changed. The cold case, warmed by evidence and tempered by debate, now occupied a rare space, neither fully settled nor fully open, a paradox sustained by time. It stood as proof that truth can be approached from multiple angles without ever being fully contained, that justice can be both achieved and questioned simultaneously. And in that tension, the case found its enduring power, not as a story with a clean ending, but as an ongoing conversation, a reminder that answers, once found, do not silence inquiry, and that the pursuit of understanding continues long after the gavel falls, echoing through institutions, communities, and the quiet spaces where memory refuses to rest. What lingered after the court's opinion was not relief, but recalibration, a subtle shift in how people spoke about certainty, about endings, about what it means to know something in a world where knowledge arrives late and imperfect. The case no longer belonged to the present tense. It lived in conditional language, upheld yet questioned, affirmed yet amended, a legal conclusion wrapped in philosophical hesitation. And that hesitation seeped into everyday life, into conversations that drifted toward the case without announcing their destination. In the town, the renovated house finally stood occupied, lights on at night, curtains drawn, a sign of ordinary life attempting to reclaim ground long surrendered to memory. New owners hosted small gatherings, unaware at first of the weight attached to their address, then gradually informed through sideways glances and hesitant disclosures. They listened politely, thanked neighbors for the information, and insisted that the past did not define the present. Still, they installed additional locks, not out of fear, they said, but practicality, a word that allowed distance without denial. The first summer after the ruling passed quietly, children rode bicycles down streets, once lined with news vans. The hum of lawn mowers replaced the memory of sirens. Yet even in this calm, the case persisted in subtle ways, in the way parents waited an extra minute before turning off porch lights, in the way doors were checked twice, not because danger felt imminent, but because history had proven that safety is never absolute. Elsewhere, the case continued to ripple outward. Defense attorneys cited it in motions, prosecutors referenced it in training sessions, and judges alluded to it in opinions that sought to balance innovation with restraint. Its name became shorthand, a symbol for a turning point, invoked without explanation among those who understood its significance. In this way, the crime transcended its origin, influencing outcomes far removed from the place where it began. Critics argued that such influence was precisely the problem. They warned against elevating any single case into doctrine, against allowing one narrative to harden into precedent without acknowledging its idiosyncrasies. They pointed to variables unique to the investigation, to choices made under specific pressures, to the danger of extrapolation. Supporters countered that progress requires examples, that principles must be tested somewhere, sometime, and that hesitation carries its own costs. The debate found a new audience through media adaptations. A serialized documentary revisited the case with cinematic flair, layering interviews, reenactments, and ominous music. It promised insight and delivered atmosphere, framing the story as both solved mystery and unresolved question. Viewers responded intensely, divided between admiration for the technology and unease about its implications. Social media, filled with arguments compressed into slogans, nuance sacrificed to immediacy. Those closest to the case watched from a distance, wary of how easily complexity could be flattened for consumption. They recognized familiar moments presented with altered emphasis, details rearranged to serve pacing rather than accuracy. Some felt vindicated by the attention, believing it kept memory alive. Others felt exposed, their grief repurposed as content. The line between awareness and exploitation blurred again. Amid this renewed visibility, small details resurfaced that had once seemed insignificant. An unanswered phone call, a neighbor's recollection that changed subtly over time, a receipt that placed someone somewhere, but not necessarily where it mattered. These fragments were discussed anew, not because they threatened the conviction, but because they resisted closure, insisting on their own unresolved presence. The convicted man filed another motion, narrower this time, focused on procedural interpretation rather than evidence. It was denied swiftly, almost perfunctorily, signaling judicial fatigue as much as legal confidence. The system, having accommodated scrutiny, now seemed eager to move on. The denial passed with little notice outside specialized circles, a footnote in a story that had grown unwieldy. In the town, attention shifted toward commemoration rather than adjudication. A community center room was named in the victim's honor, not as a memorial to violence, but as a dedication to continuity, to the idea that life, interrupted, could still inspire contribution. The dedication ceremony was modest, attended by those who remembered and those who did not, united briefly by shared acknowledgement. Speeches avoided specifics, focusing instead on themes of resilience and care. No one mentioned DNA or appeals. The choice felt deliberate, an attempt to reclaim the narrative from the machinery that had consumed it. For a moment, the victim existed outside the frame of her death, remembered for who she had been rather than what had happened. Yet memory is rarely so accommodating. Later that evening, conversations returned to familiar ground, to the lingering questions, to the sense that something essential remained elusive. People spoke of intuition, of feelings they could not justify, but could not dismiss. They acknowledged that belief does not require proof, that doubt does not require contradiction. Both can coexist, shaping perception in ways logic alone cannot govern. Experts cautioned against elevating intuition above evidence, reminding audiences of the dangers inherent in privileging feeling over fact. At the same time, they conceded that human experience cannot be fully quantified, that narratives matter not because they prove anything, but because they influence how information is received and understood. The case, they argued, demonstrated this tension vividly, a reminder that justice operates at the intersection of data and belief. As another anniversary approached, media interest surged briefly, then receded. The pattern had become predictable, almost ritualistic. Each cycle brought fewer revelations, more reflection. The story matured, shifting from investigation to interpretation, from action to analysis. It was no longer about catching someone. It was about understanding what catching someone meant. In private moments, individuals revisited their own relationship to the case. Some felt gratitude that technology had provided answers, however late. Others mourned the years lost to uncertainty, wondering how different life might have been if fear had not shaped so many choices. Still others felt detached, aware of the story's significance but removed from its emotional core. Time had diversified responses, scattering them across a spectrum rather than aligning them around a single point. The cold case, once defined by absence, now existed as an excess, too many interpretations, too many lessons, too much meaning layered onto a single event. It had become a prism, refracting broader anxieties about privacy, progress, and the reliability of institutions. In doing so, it transcended its origins, becoming less a story about a crime and more a story about how societies seek certainty in an uncertain world. And yet, at its center, the original night remained unchanged, a fixed point anchoring all subsequent discourse. No ruling, no technology, no adaptation could alter what had happened or restore what had been lost. This immutable core lent gravity to every debate, a reminder that abstraction, however sophisticated, ultimately circles back to human consequence. As dusk settled again over the town, lights flickered on one by one, mirroring a pattern repeated countless times since 1995. Life continued, shaped subtly but irrevocably by a past that refused to fully recede. The case no longer demanded attention, yet it never entirely released its hold. Existing in the background like a low-frequency sound, felt more than heard, reminding those who listen closely that some truths, once uncovered, do not conclude stories. They complicate them, leaving behind a resonance that endures long after the final word is spoken. With time, the case entered a phase few had anticipated, not escalation or resolution, but assimilation, the slow process by which something extraordinary becomes part of the ordinary landscape, referenced less for its shock and more for what it represents. The words cold case still carried weight, but they no longer landed with the same immediacy. They had become symbolic, shorthand for a broader idea that justice can arrive late and still demand to be believed. In classrooms and lecture halls, professors used the case to challenge assumptions. They asked students whether certainty derived from data should outweigh uncertainty rooted in narrative gaps. They posed hypotheticals about future technologies, about evidence yet to be invented, about crimes still unsolved, and waiting for tools that do not exist. The California case hovered over these discussions, a reminder that answers often depend less on truth than on timing. Beyond academia, policymakers debated quietly. Guidelines were drafted, revised, softened. Committees acknowledged the power of genetic genealogy while emphasizing consent, oversight, restraint. The case was never mentioned by name in these documents, but its influence was unmistakable, woven into language that stressed proportionality and transparency. It had become a ghost author of policy, shaping outcomes without demanding credit. Back in the town, the presence of the case shifted again, becoming generational. Teenagers learned about it not as news, but as lore, something their parents referenced when explaining why certain rules existed, why caution had become habit. They absorbed it with the detachment of those who inherit consequences without experiencing causes. To them, 1995 felt impossibly distant, yet the effects were embedded in the rhythms of daily life. The renovated house settled into routine. Its occupants hosted holidays, planted flowers, celebrated milestones. Gradually, neighbors stopped associating the address with tragedy and began seeing it as just another home. This normalization felt like progress to some, erasure to others. The debate surfaced quietly, never fully articulated, a tension between moving forward and honoring memory. Occasionally, a visitor would arrive, someone drawn by curiosity or research, pausing too long outside the property, asking careful questions. These moments disrupted the illusion of closure, reminding residents that the story still held power beyond local boundaries. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain contained. The victim's name appeared again in a national report examining long-term impacts of unresolved crimes. Her story was one among many, anonymized slightly, contextualized statistically. Advocates criticized the report for abstraction, arguing that aggregation risks minimizing individuality. Yet others saw value in the approach, believing that collective analysis could drive systemic improvement. The tension mirrored earlier debates, unresolved and ongoing. In quieter spaces, personal reckonings continued. One former neighbor admitted, years later, that they had dismissed a strange sound on the night of the crime, rationalizing it as nothing worth reporting. The admissions surfaced in a private conversation, heavy with regret but unaccompanied by actionable consequence. It underscored a truth rarely acknowledged, that most cases are shaped as much by inaction as by action, by what feels too small to mention until hindsight magnifies it. Therapists in the area noticed a pattern among long-term residents, a shared sensitivity to stories of delayed justice. Clients spoke of unease when watching similar cases unfold elsewhere, a visceral reaction that surprised them. The therapist described it as secondary trauma, absorbed not through direct experience, but through prolonged proximity to unresolved fear. The case had etched itself into the community's emotional architecture. Media interest resurfaced sporadically, triggered by anniversaries or related developments in forensic science. Each resurgence felt less urgent, more reflective. Journalists asked different questions now, less focused on who and more on how, less on solving and more on understanding. The tone softened, shifting from accusation to inquiry. The convicted man aged in relative obscurity. His appeals exhausted, his presence in public discourse dwindled to footnotes. To some, this quiet was justice. To others, it felt unsettling, a reminder that punishment, once imposed, often disappears from view, leaving society to move on while individuals remain confined to consequences few witness. In a rare interview, a former prosecutor reflected on the case with unexpected candor. He spoke not of victory, but of complexity, of nights spent reviewing transcripts, of doubt as a professional companion rather than an enemy. He acknowledged that certainty, once claimed, becomes a responsibility rather than a comfort. The admission resonated widely, reframing the narrative in subtle but significant ways. The idea of closure continued to be questioned. Sociologists argued that closure is a construct, a term applied retroactively to processes that never truly end. They suggested that what communities seek is not an ending, but a stable narrative, something coherent enough to live alongside. The California case, they argued, achieved this imperfectly, providing structure without eliminating ambiguity. As digital archives expanded, original reports from 1995 became more accessible, their language strikingly different from contemporary coverage. Readers noted the absence of speculation, the restraint born of limited information. The contrast highlighted how storytelling evolves with technology, how immediacy reshapes tone and expectation. The early reports felt almost innocent by comparison, unburdened by the hindsight that now framed every detail. Some residents revisited those archives late at night, drawn by a need to reconnect with the moment before everything changed. They described a strange comfort in reading uncertainty untempered by resolution, a reminder that not knowing had once been the only option. The past, seen through its own lens, felt less demanding than the present, which insisted on interpretation. The cold case designation, once a label of stagnation, now carried layered meaning. It represented patience, progress, and paradox. It symbolized both the failure of earlier methods and the promise of future ones. It became a term less about temperature and more about time, about how long truth can remain dormant before circumstances allow it to surface. As discussions about artificial intelligence and predictive policing gained traction, the case was invoked again, this time as a boundary marker. Experts cautioned against assuming that more data guarantees better outcomes, pointing to the necessity of human judgment, of ethical frameworks capable of keeping pace with innovation. The case served as a reminder that tools do not operate in isolation. They amplify the values embedded within their use. In the town, daily life continued with understated resilience. People aged, children grew, businesses changed hands. The case did not define these changes, but it colored them, adding depth to a shared understanding of vulnerability and endurance. It was no longer an interruption, but a layer integrated into collective identity. On an unremarkable evening, long after the last appeal had been decided, a local librarian curated a small exhibit on the history of the town. Photographs, documents, newspaper clippings. The case was included, but not centered. It occupied a single panel, contextualized among other events that had shaped the community. Visitors paused, read, moved on. The choice felt intentional, an acknowledgement without fixation. Standing there, one visitor remarked quietly that the story felt different now, less sharp, more distant. Another replied that distance does not erase impact. It only changes how it's felt. The exchange captured the evolution of the case better than any analysis, a recognition that meaning shifts with perspective, that time does not heal so much as it reframes. The cold case, once defined by its refusal to yield answers, now existed as a lesson rather than a mystery. It taught patience without promising peace, clarity without simplicity. It remained a reminder that justice is not an endpoint, but a continuum, shaped by technology, interpretation, and the willingness to confront uncertainty without demanding its elimination. And as night settled once more over the town, the story receded into the background, not forgotten, not resolved, but absorbed, part of the quiet knowledge that some truths arrive late, some questions persist, and some cases, even when solved, continue to echo softly, shaping the present through the long shadow of what came before. The passage of time altered the case in ways no ruling ever could, stretching it thin across years until it became less a singular event and more a thread woven through countless other stories, personal and institutional alike. What once dominated headlines now surfaced quietly, in footnotes, in references, in moments when someone paused and said, almost reflexively, "This reminds me of that case." The reminder carried weight, not because of what it resolved, but because of what it revealed about how resolution itself is understood. New investigators entering the profession learned about the case not as breaking news, but as background, a foundational example introduced early in training. It was presented alongside others, stripped of drama, reduced to bullet points and lessons learned. Some trainees absorbed it clinically. Others felt a chill reading between the lines, sensing the human cost that no slide could fully convey. The case functioned as a rite of passage, a reminder that the work would follow them long after shifts ended. In the justice system, the case quietly influenced policy language, appearing indirectly in reforms designed to clarify evidentiary standards. Legislators debated thresholds, safeguards, definitions. They spoke of balance, of public trust, of the need to move deliberately even as technology accelerated. The case lingered in these rooms as an unspoken reference, shaping caution without demanding acknowledgement. For the victim's family, time brought a different rhythm, one less dictated by court calendars and media cycles. Grief, long accustomed to interruption, finally settled into something resembling routine. They learned how to carry memory without constantly defending it, how to let the story exist without monitoring its every retelling. This distance was not indifference, but preservation, a way to protect what remained private from a world that had already taken so much. Occasionally, a stranger would reach out, someone who had encountered the case through a documentary or article and felt compelled to express sympathy. The messages were kind, well-intentioned, and gently declined. The family understood that curiosity often masquerades as concern, that attention, even compassionate attention, carries its own burden. They chose quiet continuity instead. In the town, generational turnover continued. New residents arrived with no memory of the crime, learning about it only if someone chose to mention it. Some longtime residents welcomed this amnesia, seeing it as progress. Others felt uneasy, worrying that forgetting eroded vigilance. The debate played out subtly in comments made at block meetings, in how history was or was not shared. The renovated house blended further into the neighborhood, its story fading as neighbors grew accustomed to its presence. The fact that life could resume there unsettled some and comforted others. It served as a tangible demonstration that places, unlike people, can be repurposed, their meanings altered through use. Whether that alteration constituted healing or erasure remained subjective. At conferences, the case continued to appear in presentations about forensic genealogy, now framed as an early chapter in an ongoing evolution. Speakers emphasized refinement, oversight, accountability. They acknowledged mistakes made elsewhere, lessons learned through trial and error. The California case was often cited as a pivot point, a moment when potential became practice and scrutiny followed inevitably. Critics remained active, publishing essays that revisited the case with fresh skepticism. They argued that normalization breeds complacency, that success stories can obscure systemic flaws. They questioned whether future cases would receive the same level of scrutiny or whether precedent would dull critical engagement. Their work found a niche audience, less visible but persistent. Supporters responded with equal conviction, pointing to safeguards implemented precisely because of such critiques. They framed the case as evidence that systems can adapt, that feedback loops, however imperfect, do function. The exchange rarely produced consensus, but it sustained dialogue, a sign that the case continued to matter beyond its immediate outcome. In media studies, the case was analyzed as an example of narrative transformation. Early reporting emphasized shock and fear. Later coverage highlighted innovation and justice. Eventually, the tone shifted again toward reflection and complexity. Scholars traced this arc, noting how public appetite influences framing, how stories mature alongside audiences. The case offered a rare longitudinal view of this process. Late one afternoon, a retired reporter who had covered the crime in 1995 reread his original notes. He was struck by their urgency, by how little he had known and how much he had felt compelled to say. He compared them to his later pieces, more measured, more cautious. The contrast revealed his own evolution, mirroring that of the case itself. He wondered which version had been truer, the raw immediacy of the early days, or the tempered analysis that came with distance. In a separate moment of reflection, a former juror spoke privately about the lingering presence of the case in her life. She described moments of doubt, not about the verdict, but about the weight of having decided another person's fate. The responsibility had not diminished with time. It had simply changed shape, becoming less acute but more pervasive. The convicted man's name surfaced briefly in a routine administrative update, then disappeared again. There were no new developments, no surprises. His story had narrowed to procedure, his existence defined by institutional rhythms. Public interest had moved on, leaving behind a quiet acknowledgement that accountability, once enforced, rarely remains visible. In the town library, a high school student researching local history stumbled upon the case. Reading late into the evening, she felt a mix of fascination and unease, struck by how long uncertainty had endured. She interviewed residents for her project, collecting perspectives that contradicted one another gently rather than violently. Her paper concluded without a thesis, reflecting the complexity she encountered. Her teacher praised the honesty. That complexity became the case's enduring legacy. It resisted simplification, defied singular interpretation. It existed comfortably in contradiction, celebrated as success and scrutinized as warning, remembered and forgotten in equal measure. The cold case label no longer felt accurate. The story had warmed, cooled, and settled into an ambient temperature, neither urgent nor inert. As broader cultural conversations shifted toward accountability and transparency, the case resurfaced occasionally as an example of delayed reckoning. Commentators debated whether delayed justice could ever fully compensate for delayed truth. Opinions diverged sharply, shaped by personal philosophy rather than evidence. The case provided context, but not answers. In moments of quiet, residents reflected on how the story had shaped them without demanding their attention. They recognized habits formed unconsciously, boundaries drawn without explicit reasoning. The crime had taught lessons that persisted even after fear subsided, embedded in behavior rather than belief. On an evening marked by no anniversary, no media trigger, no external prompt, a group of neighbors gathered casually, conversation drifting as it always did. Someone mentioned the case in passing, not with intensity, but as one might reference a shared memory. The mention elicited nods, not debate. The story had become communal knowledge, neither sensational nor sacred. That normalization marked a turning point. The case had completed its transformation from crisis to context. It no longer demanded interpretation, it offered it. It stood as a reminder that certainty is negotiated, that truth emerges unevenly, and that justice, once pursued, continues to evolve in memory long after institutions declare it complete. As the night settled in, ordinary sounds filled the air, laughter, traffic, the low murmur of life continuing. Somewhere within that continuity, the case persisted, not as an open wound or a closed chapter, but as a footnote written in human terms, shaped by time, reflection, and the understanding that some stories do not end with resolution. They simply find new ways to exist, quieter, deeper, and permanently entwined with the places and people they touched. By the time the case reached its 30th year, it no longer announced itself. It surfaced quietly, almost shyly, in moments where people paused mid-sentence, searching for an example, a comparison, a reference point for how long answers can take to arrive. It had become less a story and more a measure, a way of understanding time itself, stretched and folded by uncertainty. The shock that once defined it had dissolved into something steadier, more reflective, yet no less profound. Anniversary pieces appeared again, though their tone had softened. Reporters no longer chased outrage. They chased meaning. Articles asked what the case had changed, not just locally but culturally, how it had influenced expectations about justice and technology. The answers were fragmented, inconsistent, revealing more about those asked than about the case itself. Some spoke of hope, others of caution, many of both. In the town, commemorations were understated, almost invisible. There were no official events, no public statements. The absence felt intentional, a collective agreement that remembrance did not require ceremony. People marked the passage of time privately, through reflection rather than ritual. The date passed like any other, yet it carried weight for those who noticed. The renovated house, now fully integrated into the neighborhood, stood as a quiet contradiction. It embodied continuity where rupture once dominated. Children who lived there knew nothing of the past unless told, their laughter filling rooms once associated with silence. Some neighbors found this comforting, proof that life reclaims space. Others found it unsettling, a reminder that history can be overwritten without being resolved. Experts continued to reference the case in broader discussions about the future of investigation. They spoke of emerging technologies, of predictive algorithms, of data sets growing faster than ethical frameworks. The case was cited as a lesson in restraint, an example of how powerful tools must be paired with humility. It served as a reminder that innovation, unchecked, can outrun understanding. In courtrooms elsewhere, judges invoked the case indirectly, emphasizing clarity in expert testimony, urging jurors to distinguish between likelihood and certainty. These moments passed unnoticed by the public, but mattered deeply within the system. They represented the case's quiet legacy, embedded not in headlines, but in practice. The victim's family lived mostly outside the story now. They had learned to let it exist without supervision, trusting that memory could survive without constant reinforcement. Their grief, once public, had become private again, reshaped by time into something manageable, if never fully healed. They carried her with them in ordinary ways, in traditions, in anecdotes, in decisions made with her absence in mind. Occasionally, they encountered the case unexpectedly in a podcast episode, a book reference, a passing comment. These moments brought a familiar tightening, a reminder that the world continued to engage with what they had endured. They acknowledged the attention without resentment, recognizing that stories, once released, cannot be retrieved. The convicted man aged further, his name appearing rarely, stripped of narrative context. He existed now as an outcome rather than a character, a conclusion more than a presence. This reduction felt appropriate to some, unjust to others. It underscored a truth rarely discussed, that accountability often fades from view once imposed, leaving interpretation to those who remain outside the consequences. In academic journals, scholars revisited the case with distance, no longer debating its specifics, but using it as a baseline. They compared newer cases against it, measuring advances, identifying blind spots. The case functioned as a historical marker, a snapshot of a system in transition. One essay argued that the case illustrated the illusion of finality, that every resolution carries the seeds of future reconsideration. Another countered that perpetual doubt undermines trust, that societies require moments of closure to function. The debate echoed earlier conversations, refined but unresolved. The case provided material but not answers. In the town's public spaces, subtle markers remained. A plaque in the community center, a scholarship fund mentioned occasionally. These acknowledgments were quiet, integrated, not designed to draw attention. They reflected a preference for continuity over commemoration, for honoring without reopening. Local law enforcement recruits heard about the case during orientation, framed as a lesson in patience and responsibility. Veterans emphasized the importance of documentation, of preserving evidence for futures that cannot be predicted. They spoke not with pride, but with gravity, aware that the case's success was inseparable from its delays. Late one evening, a retired detective reviewed old files unrelated to the case, prompted by a request from a historian. He found himself lingering on familiar pages, recalling the frustration of limited tools, the weight of unanswered questions. He reflected on how the case had shaped his career, not through resolution, but through endurance. It had taught him to accept uncertainty without surrendering effort. In cultural discourse, the term cold case evolved, influenced in part by this story. It no longer implied stagnation alone, but potential, the idea that answers might be waiting for circumstances to align. This shift carried optimism and risk, encouraging persistence while raising expectations that technology might solve everything. The case stood as both inspiration and warning. Public memory continued to soften. Younger generations encountered the case as history, not threat. They engaged with it intellectually rather than emotionally, interested in its implications more than its impact. This detachment marked progress and loss simultaneously, a sign that trauma fades even as lessons remain. The story's power endured not in shock, but in resonance. It lingered because it refused simplicity, because it asked more questions than it answered, because it demonstrated how truth can be both discovered and contested. The case had outgrown its origin, becoming a lens through which broader issues were examined. As night fell once more over the town, ordinary routines unfolded uninterrupted. Porch lights clicked on. Doors were locked without anxiety. Life moved forward, carrying the past quietly rather than dragging it behind. The case no longer demanded attention, yet it remained present, a reminder that some truths arrive slowly, some answers complicate rather than conclude, and some stories, even when declared finished, continue to shape understanding in ways too subtle to announce themselves. The California cold case, once frozen in uncertainty, now existed in equilibrium, neither urgent nor inert, a testament to the enduring complexity of justice and memory. It stood as proof that resolution is not an endpoint, but a transformation, changing how a story is held rather than releasing it entirely. And in that transformation, the case found its final, quiet power, not as a dramatic conclusion, but as a lasting influence, woven into the fabric of a community and the evolving conscience of a system still learning how to listen to the past. There is a moment, late at night, when the town sounds different, when distance flattens noise, and even memory seems to hold its breath, and in that suspended quiet the case returns not as a headline or a lesson, but as a sensation, a faint pressure behind the eyes, a reminder that some truths never fully settle. It is in this hour that the story completes its final turn, not toward clarity, but toward understanding of a different kind, one shaped less by answers than by endurance. The streets look ordinary now, almost aggressively so, lined with parked cars and trimmed hedges, illuminated by streetlights that hum softly as if nothing remarkable has ever happened beneath them. Yet the ordinary carries weight. Every sidewalk has absorbed footsteps of people who lived through the waiting, the doubt, the years when the case was unresolved and the fear was unspoken but present. That residue cannot be photographed or archived, but it exists, woven into routine. For those who remember the early days, the images remain sharp. The initial confusion, the way the community leaned inward, searching faces for reassurance that could not be offered, the sense that something fundamental had shifted, that safety was suddenly conditional. These memories surface without warning, triggered by unrelated events, a siren in the distance, a news alert, a name that sounds almost familiar. The case no longer needs to be told to be felt. Its presence has become implicit, shaping how people interpret uncertainty, how they respond to delayed answers. It taught patience, but not the gentle kind. It taught the kind forged by necessity, by the realization that waiting does not guarantee relief. It also taught vigilance, not as paranoia, but as awareness sharpened by experience. In institutions, the case continues to echo quietly. Policies influenced by its trajectory now operate without reference to their origin, normalized through repetition. Evidence preservation protocols, review committees, ethical oversight panels. Each carries traces of decisions made in response to this story, though few remember the catalyst. This is how impact often works, diffused, absorbed, rendered invisible through success. The investigators who remained connected to the case, even peripherally, learned to live with its ambiguity. Some found satisfaction in resolution, however complex. Others remained uneasy, aware that closure does not erase uncertainty, it merely reframes it. They spoke less about victory and more about responsibility, about the weight of knowing that outcomes ripple outward, affecting lives beyond the immediate scope of justice. For the victim's family, the passage of time has softened nothing essential. Love remains sharp. Absence remains absolute. Yet the case's evolution has allowed them to reclaim parts of their story once overshadowed by public interest. They speak of her now, without preamble, without context, as someone who existed beyond tragedy. This reclamation feels like a quiet triumph, one achieved not through verdicts, but through memory preserved on their own terms. The community, too, has reclaimed its narrative. The town is no longer defined by what happened, but by what continued afterward. Schools expanded, businesses opened and closed, families arrived and left. Life insisted on motion, even when reflection slowed it. The case became part of local history, not as a defining feature, but as a chapter that informed what followed. Younger residents encounter the story differently. For them, it is abstract, a case study rather than a lived experience. They analyze it, discuss it, debate its implications with intellectual curiosity. This distance protects them, but it also creates a gap, one that older residents recognize instinctively. The difference is not in knowledge, but in weight. Some lessons can only be learned through proximity. The media, having moved on, returns occasionally, not to revisit the facts, but to explore the themes the case embodies. Trust, time, technology, the human cost of waiting. These explorations are quieter, more reflective, stripped of urgency. They treat the case as a mirror rather than a mystery, reflecting broader anxieties rather than generating new ones. In these retellings, the cold case label feels almost ironic. What was once frozen has warmed, thawed by years of conversation and consequence. Yet it has not disappeared. It has settled into a steady presence, no longer demanding resolution, but offering perspective. The mystery has given way to meditation. There are still unanswered questions. There always will be. They hover at the edges of the story, acknowledged, but not pursued with the same intensity. This acceptance marks a shift, a collective decision to live with partial understanding. It is not resignation, but recognition that some aspects of truth resist final articulation. At night, when the town rests, these questions feel closer. They surface in the quiet spaces where distraction recedes. But they no longer provoke fear. They provoke contemplation. They remind those who listen that certainty is often constructed, negotiated over time, rather than discovered whole. The case's final legacy may lie here, in this transformed relationship with the unknown. It taught that resolution does not eliminate doubt, that answers can coexist with ambiguity. It demonstrated that justice, when delayed, carries different meanings for different people, and that its arrival, however dramatic, does not conclude the story. What remains is a sense of continuity. The case did not end, it integrated. It became part of how the community understands itself, how institutions approach responsibility, how individuals interpret delayed truth. It left marks that are subtle but enduring, shaped